The document remained on her editor's desk for 3 full weeks before anyone truly understood what it signified. 11 pages in total, single-spaced format, documenting corruption that extended into the highest echelons of local government administration. Charlotte Reed had made a promise to deliver the story by Monday, October 7th, 2019. But Charlotte never reached that Monday. She vanished on Sunday night, October 6th, and the explosive investigation she had been developing for 6 consecutive months disappeared along with her. The story would eventually see publication, but without its author present to witness it. And the questions surrounding her disappearance would prove far more disturbing and troubling than any corruption she had ever exposed throughout her career. Before we delve deeply into this particular case, if you possess a passion for true crime and investigative journalism, please subscribe and activate that notification bell. This channel maintains a commitment to telling these stories with the depth and respect they rightfully deserve, and your support makes that possible and sustainable. Today's case involves a dedicated and committed journalist, a web of potential suspects with various motives, and a mystery that continues to haunt the Texas media community to this very day. What exactly happened to Charlotte Reed on that October night? Was her disappearance connected directly to her work and investigations, or was it a tragic coincidence that occurred at the worst possible time imaginable? By the end of this video presentation, you will understand why investigators believe someone did not want Charlotte's story to see the light of day, and why her case remains one of the most troubling and disturbing unsolved disappearances in recent Texas history. Charlotte Marie Reed was 31 years old when she disappeared from existence, standing 5 feet 6 inches tall with an athletic build that came from years of running 5 miles every single morning before beginning work. She weighed approximately 130 pounds, with shoulder-length auburn hair that she usually wore pulled back in a practical ponytail for functionality, and piercing green eyes that colleagues consistently said could make even the most evasive interview subject uncomfortable and willing to talk. On her left forearm, she had a small tattoo depicting a fountain pen crossed with a sword, a symbol she had gotten permanently, inked after winning her first major journalism award of significance. She wore simple silver stud earrings on a daily basis and a vintage Timex watch that had belonged to her grandfather, a former newspaper editor who had inspired and influenced her career choice significantly. Born in Houston, Texas, Charlotte had grown up within a middle-class family that valued education highly and civic responsibility deeply. Her father, Thomas Reed, was a high school history teacher with decades of experience, while her mother, Patricia, worked as a librarian in the local public library system. Charlotte was an only child in the family, and her parents had poured all their hopes and financial resources into ensuring she had every opportunity available to succeed in life. From an early age and throughout her childhood, Charlotte had shown a fierce curiosity about the world around her and an unwavering commitment to fairness and justice that would come to define her entire life and career. She had graduated from the University of Texas at Austin with a degree in journalism and political science, graduating summa cum laude in the year 2010. Her professors remembered and recalled her as relentless and determined, the kind of student who would chase down sources for days on end to verify a single fact or claim, who would rather miss a deadline than publish something incomplete or unverified. After graduation from university, she had worked her way up progressively through small-town newspapers scattered across Texas, cutting her teeth on local government meetings, school board controversies and disputes, and the kind of unglamorous beat reporting that taught young journalists how to dig systematically for truth and verification. By the year 2015, Charlotte had successfully landed a position at the Austin Chronicle, one of Texas's most respected and influential alternative newspapers, where she had built a solid reputation as a fearless, investigative reporter with integrity. Her specialty and focus was exposing corruption in local government structures, particularly regarding misuse of public funds and conflicts of interest among elected officials serving the public. She had broken stories about city council members accepting illegal kickbacks from contractors, about developers bribing zoning officials to change regulations, about police departments covering up misconduct and abuse. Her work and reporting had led to 3 resignations from public office, 2 criminal investigations by authorities, and 1 FBI probe into federal crimes. She had won the Texas Associated Press Managing Editors Award twice in her career, and had been a finalist for a National Investigative Journalism Prize of considerable prestige. Those who worked directly with Charlotte described her as intensely focused on her work and deeply principled in her approach to journalism. Her editor at the Chronicle, Michael Stevens, would later tell investigators and detectives that Charlotte was the most dedicated and committed journalist he had ever supervised in his entire career. She would work 12-hour days without complaint or hesitation, would return phone calls at midnight if a source finally decided to talk and share information, would spend weeks patiently building relationships with whistleblowers who were terrified to come forward publicly. She never burned a source or betrayed a confidence, never broke a confidence or trust, and never published anything she could not prove conclusively with documentation and evidence. But Charlotte was not solely defined by her work and professional life. She had a life outside the newsroom that grounded her emotionally and kept her connected to the community she served through her reporting. She shared a small apartment in South Austin with her best friend from college years, Jessica Williams, a social worker who often worried that Charlotte pushed herself too hard professionally and personally. Every Sunday morning without fail, Charlotte volunteered at a local food bank, serving breakfast to homeless individuals and listening to their stories with compassion. She played guitar moderately well and with decent skill, and would occasionally perform at open mic nights at a coffee shop near her apartment, mostly covering folk songs from the 1960s and 1970s eras. Charlotte's personal life was quieter and more subdued than her professional one. She had been in a committed relationship with Andrew Clark, a public defender working in the legal system, for almost 3 years of her life. They had met at a community activism event focused on social justice and had bonded over their shared commitment to justice and their mutual frustration with systems that failed the vulnerable members of society. Andrew would later say and testify that Charlotte was the most genuine person he had ever known in his life, someone who lived her values every single day without pretense or self-righteousness about her principles. They had talked seriously about marriage, about eventually buying a house together as a couple, about the future they were actively building together. He was her partner in every sense of the word, supporting her through the stress and pressure of investigative work while pursuing his own demanding career in public defense. Charlotte's typical routine and daily schedule was structured carefully around her work, but maintained important personal boundaries for her well-being. She would wake at 5:30 every morning without an alarm, run her 5 miles through the neighborhood streets, and be at her desk by 7:30 with a large black coffee from the shop downstairs in her building. She would work until 6 most evenings on average, occasionally later if she was closing in on a deadline for publication. Tuesday nights were reserved specifically for dinner with Andrew as a couple. Thursday evenings, she volunteered at a youth journalism program, mentoring high school students interested in reporting and writing. Weekends were dedicated for research, interviews with sources, and the deep investigative work that could not be rushed or hurried. In the months leading up to October 2019, Charlotte had been working intensively on what she told friends would be the biggest story of her career to date. She had been investigating a web of corruption involving Austin city officials in 19 positions of power, a major real estate development company with significant resources, and what appeared to be systematic fraud in the allocation of affordable housing contracts for low-income residents. The story was complex and multifaceted, involving shell companies created to hide assets, falsified documents to deceive authorities, and millions in taxpayer money that had been diverted from programs meant to help low-income families in need. Charlotte had been meticulous and thorough in her research, building a case that was airtight and bulletproof, that could not be dismissed or deflected by those implicated. She had told her editor that the story would be ready by Monday, October 7th, for publication. She had told Andrew that once this story broke publicly, things might get uncomfortable for a while and there would be backlash, that powerful people would be angry and defensive, but that it was too important not to publish and share with the public. She had told Jessica that this was the kind of journalism she had always wanted to do professionally, the kind that actually changed things materially and held power accountable to the people. On Saturday, October 5th, she had texted her mother with excitement. "Working on something big and important. Cannot wait to tell you about it. Love you." There were no signs whatsoever of depression or mental health struggles, no indication she was planning to disappear voluntarily, no evidence of any personal crisis that would make someone walk away from their life completely. Charlotte Reed loved her work and found meaning in it, loved the people in her life deeply, and was on the verge of publishing the most important story of her career thus far. Everything about her circumstances suggested a woman fully invested in her present and future life, someone with every reason to stay exactly where she was and continue her work. And then, on the evening of Sunday, October 6th, 2019, Charlotte Reed drove away from her apartment to meet a source for what she told Jessica would be a quick interview session, a final confirmation of some details before she submitted her story the next day for publication. She never came home that night, and the investigation into her disappearance would reveal that the truth Charlotte had been chasing relentlessly may have been far more dangerous than anyone, including Charlotte herself, had realized or anticipated. Sunday, October 6, 2019, began with typical Texas autumn weather patterns, temperatures in the mid-70s, with clear skies and a gentle breeze that made it perfect running weather for outdoor exercise. Charlotte woke at her usual 5:30 in the morning, went for her run through the South Austin neighborhoods she knew by heart from memory, and returned to the apartment she shared with Jessica at 6:45. Jessica was making coffee when Charlotte came in from her run, and they chatted briefly about their plans for the day ahead. Charlotte mentioned she had some final work to do on her big story, that she was meeting a source later that evening for an interview, and that she would probably be done by 9 or 10 at the latest estimate. Charlotte spent most of the day at her desk in her bedroom, which she had converted into a small home office for work. Her laptop logs would later show investigators she was working on her document from 8:15 in the morning until 3:30 in the EE. Afternoon, making final edits and revisions, double-checking facts meticulously, ensuring every claim was supported by documentation and evidence. At noon, she took a break to make lunch for herself, a turkey sandwich that she ate while reviewing printed pages of her article, marking them up with a red pen for corrections. Jessica remembered Charlotte seemed excited, but also nervous about publication, the way she always got before publishing something major and controversial. At 3:45 in the afternoon, Charlotte's phone records show she received a call from an unknown number not in her contacts. The call lasted 4 minutes and 32 seconds according to records. Jessica was not home at the time of the call, so there is no witness to what was discussed during the conversation. But phone records confirm definitively the call occurred. Investigators would later trace this number to a burner phone purchased with cash at a convenience store in Round Rock, Texas, 3 days earlier before the call. Security footage from that purchase showed a man in his 40s wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses to obscure his face, but the image quality made identification impossible for investigators. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Charlotte texted Andrew with a message. "Meeting source tonight around 7. Should be quick and efficient. Want to grab late dinner after? Miss you?" Followed by a heart emoji. Andrew responded 10 minutes later with his reply, "Absolutely yes. Text me when you are done. Be safe." It was the last text message Charlotte would ever send to anyone. At 5:15 in the afternoon, Charlotte showered and changed clothes for her meeting. Jessica, who had returned home by then from her errands, remembers Charlotte wearing dark jeans, a black pullover sweater, and her usual brown leather jacket that she loved. She wore her hair down and loose, which was unusual for work meetings with sources, and Jessica would later wonder if that detail meant anything significant. Charlotte grabbed her messenger bag, which contained her laptop computer, notebook for notes, phone charger, and the printed copy of her article with her handwritten notes and edits. She also took a small digital voice recorder, which she always used for interviews to ensure accuracy of quotes. At 5:40 in the afternoon, Charlotte walked out of the apartment, telling Jessica with confidence, "Back by 9, probably. Do not wait up if you are tired." Jessica said, Charlotte seemed calm and professional, focused in the way she always was before important interviews with sources. There was no indication of fear or concern about the meeting. Charlotte got into her car, a 2014 silver Honda Civic, license plate number documented in the police report later, and drove away from the apartment. Charlotte's movements over the next hour can be partially traced through her phone's location data and security cameras from various businesses along her route. At 6:05 in the evening, her phone pinged a cell tower near Interstate 35, suggesting she was heading north out of Austin toward her destination. At 6:23 in the evening, a gas station security camera in the town of Round Rock, approximately 20 miles north of Austin, captured Charlotte's Honda pulling in to fill up with gasoline. The timestamp shows her pumping gas into her vehicle, going inside to pay cash totaling $40, and purchasing a bottle of water for hydration. She was alone in the footage, appeared normal in behavior, and left the gas station at 6:31 in the evening. At 6:52 in the evening, her phone pinged a cell tower near Georgetown, Texas, a small city about 30 miles north of Austin proper. This was the last confirmed location data from Charlotte's phone device. The device either was turned off deliberately or destroyed shortly after this ping because it never connected to another tower again after that. Time. Here is where the timeline goes dark and unaccounted for approximately 90 minutes of time. Charlotte was supposed to be meeting her source, presumably somewhere in the Georgetown area based on that final phone location data. But who was this source she was meeting? What were they meeting about specifically? And why did Charlotte, who was always careful about safety protocols, agree to meet someone alone in a location outside Austin, where she worked? Investigators would later comb through meticulously Charlotte's notes, emails, and text messages, trying to identify who she was meeting that evening. They found references in her encrypted notebook to CS, presumably the source's initials based on context, but no full name written anywhere. There were notations about final confirmation on wire transfers and documents proving connection between parties. Whatever Charlotte was investigating had led her to this source, someone who apparently had information crucial to her story and its publication. At 8:37 in the evening, Andrew texted Charlotte with a message. "Hey, how is it going? Almost done?" No response came back. At 9:15 in the evening, he called her phone. The call went straight to voicemail, without ringing. At 9:45 in the evening, growing concerned about her silence, he called again, with increasing worry. Still voicemail, immediately. At 10:30 in the evening, he called Jessica at the apartment, asking if Charlotte had come home yet. Jessica said no, and that she had expected her back by now, based on what Charlotte said. At 11:15 in the evening, Andrew called the Austin Police Department to report Charlotte as missing officially. The police response was initially measured and routine. A 31-year-old woman missing for a few hours was not immediately treated as an emergency situation. The officer taking the report noted Andrew's concerns carefully, but explained that adults have the right to be out of contact voluntarily, that most missing person cases resolve within 24 hours without incident. But Andrew insisted this was different and unusual, that Charlotte was working on a sensitive story involving powerful people, that she would never go silent like this without explanation or contact. He provided the officer with Charlotte's phone number, car description and make, and license plate information for their records. At 1:43 in the morning on Monday, October 7th, a Georgetown police officer conducting a routine patrol discovered Charlotte's silver Honda Civic parked in a remote area called Blue Hole Park, a local swimming spot on the San Gabriel River. The park was officially closed after dark by regulation, and the car's presence there was immediately suspicious to the officer. The officer ran the plates through the system, saw the Austin Police Department missing person report filed hours earlier, and immediately called for backup assistance. By 2:30 in the morning, the area was swarming with law enforcement from multiple agencies. Austin Police Department sent detectives to the scene, Georgetown Police secured the scene with tape, and the Travis County Sheriff's Office provided additional support and resources. The car was empty of occupants. The doors were unlocked and not forced. Charlotte's messenger bag sat on the passenger seat, containing her laptop computer, her notebook with research, and the printed copy of her article. Her phone was not in the vehicle anywhere. Her keys were not in the vehicle. The digital voice recorder she had taken was not in the vehicle either. There were no signs of struggle inside the car upon examination. No blood evidence, no torn fabric, no evidence of violence or confrontation. The driver's seat was adjusted to a position consistent with someone of Charlotte's height driving. A half-empty bottle of water sat in the cup holder, the same brand she had purchased at the gas station hours earlier. Everything suggested she had driven here voluntarily, parked the vehicle, and then either left the car on her own or was taken from it forcibly. The park itself was searched extensively as dawn broke on Monday morning with better visibility. Blue Hole Park covers approximately 110 acres of heavily wooded terrain along the river with difficult geography. Search teams with dogs covered every trail, every clearing, every section of riverbank systematically. They found nothing of significance. No clothing items, no signs of disturbance, no indication that Charlotte had been anywhere in that park. It was as if she had parked her car and simply vanished into the darkness without a trace. Detective Marcus Hayes of the Austin Police Department's Missing Persons Unit took lead on the investigation officially. Hayes was a 22-year veteran with extensive experience in complex cases involving missing persons, and within hours of arriving at Blue Hole Park, he knew this was going to be one of the most challenging investigations of his career. Every instinct told him that Charlotte's disappearance was connected to her work and investigations, but proving it would require navigating a minefield of powerful interests and potential suspects with resources. The first priority for investigators was Charlotte's laptop and the article she had been working on diligently. Forensic analysts extracted the 11-page document and began reading carefully what Charlotte had uncovered through her investigation. The story was explosive and damaging. Charlotte had documented a scheme involving Austin City Council member Richard Brennan, developer Marcus Holloway of Holloway Construction Group, and several intermediaries who had systematically defrauded the city's affordable housing program for personal gain. According to Charlotte's investigation and documentation, millions of dollars in contracts meant for low-income housing had been awarded to Holloway's companies through rigged bidding processes designed to exclude legitimate competition. The developments were either never completed as promised, or were built so poorly they were uninhabitable for residents. But the money had already been paid out and disappeared into a web of shell companies designed to hide the flow of funds. Charlotte had obtained bank records showing wire transfers between Holloway's accounts and accounts controlled by Brennan's brother-in-law acting as intermediary. She had emails discussing the scheme in coded language to avoid detection. She had testimony from a whistleblower inside Holloway's company who confirmed the fraud directly. The story was thoroughly researched and legally airtight for publication. When published, it would almost certainly result in criminal charges, resignations from office, and a massive scandal affecting Austin politics. Detective Hayes immediately recognized the problem facing the investigation. Charlotte's investigation had given multiple powerful people strong motives to want her silenced permanently. Richard Brennan faced potential prison time and the destruction of his political career and reputation. Marcus Holloway faced financial ruin and criminal prosecution for fraud. Anyone else implicated in the scheme would be desperate to prevent publication of the story. The question was whether any of them were desperate enough to kidnap or harm a journalist to protect themselves. Brennan and Holloway were both interviewed within the first 48 hours of the investigation. Both expressed shock and surprise at Charlotte's disappearance. Both denied any involvement whatsoever. Both provided alibis for Sunday evening activities. Brennan claimed he was home with his wife all evening, watching television together and going to bed around 10 in the evening. His wife confirmed this account, though investigators noted that spouses are not always reliable alibi witnesses due to loyalty. Holloway claimed he was at a business dinner in Houston from 6 in the evening until midnight, and he provided the names of 3 business associates who confirmed his presence there. The alibis were checked thoroughly by investigators. Security cameras at the Houston restaurant confirmed Holloway's presence from 6:45 in the evening until 11:30 at night. His cell phone records showed him making calls from Houston during that time frame with location data. Unless he had hired someone to act on his behalf, Holloway appeared to be physically accounted for during the critical time. Brennan's alibi was weaker in comparison, relying only on his wife's testimony and the lack of any evidence placing him elsewhere. But it could not be definitively broken by investigators. Investigators expanded their search to anyone else mentioned in Charlotte's article by name or implication. They interviewed the whistleblower who had provided information to Charlotte, a former Holloway construction project manager named David Summers. Summers was terrified and fearful, convinced that whoever had taken Charlotte might come for him next as a witness. He provided a solid alibi for Sunday evening and passed a polygraph test administered by professionals. He also told investigators that during his conversations with Charlotte over several weeks, she had mentioned being followed on 2 separate occasions in September, though she had not been able to identify who was tailing her movements. This revelation sent the investigation in a new direction entirely. Had Charlotte been under surveillance by someone? Detective Hayes obtained Charlotte's phone records and began analyzing her movements meticulously in the weeks before her disappearance. They found something troubling in the data. On 3 separate occasions in late September, Charlotte's phone had pinged cell towers in unusual patterns, as if someone else's phone was tracking her movements consistently, staying close, but not too close to avoid detection. Technical analysts determined that someone had been running counter-surveillance on Charlotte, following her systematically, but maintaining enough distance to avoid detection by her. The burner phone that had called Charlotte on October 6th became a crucial piece of evidence in the investigation. Investigators traced its activity and found it had been used only 4 times total. Once to call Charlotte, once to text an unidentified number that also turned out to be a burner phone, and twice to receive calls from that same unidentified number. The pattern suggested coordination between at least 2 people, possibly more individuals involved. The phones had both been purchased with cash, leaving no paper trail to follow for identification. Charlotte's apartment was processed as a potential crime scene by forensics, though investigators found no evidence of disturbance or struggle. Her computer files were analyzed extensively by specialists. Her email correspondence was reviewed line by line. Her encrypted notes were decrypted with Jessica's help. She knew Charlotte's system and passwords. Everything pointed to a journalist who had stumbled onto something dangerous and had been meticulous about protecting her sources and evidence from discovery. The media seized on the story immediately with intense coverage. Journalist vanishes. While investigating corruption became front-page news across Texas, national outlets picked it up within days of the disappearance. Charlotte's editor at the Austin Chronicle made the difficult decision to publish her story posthumously, reasoning that if her disappearance was connected to her investigation, the best tribute to Charlotte would be ensuring her work saw the light of day and reached the public. The article published on October 14, 2019, 8 days after Charlotte vanished, and it created exactly the firestorm Charlotte had anticipated. Richard Brennan resigned from the city council within hours of publication, citing personal reasons officially. Marcus Holloway's company filed for bankruptcy 3 weeks later under financial pressure. The Travis County District Attorney opened a criminal investigation into the allegations. The Federal Bureau of Investigation got involved due to the interstate nature of some of the financial transactions documented. Charlotte's journalism had achieved exactly what she had wanted: exposure and accountability for wrongdoing. But she was not there to witness it or its impact. The investigation into Charlotte's disappearance continued intensively for weeks without breakthrough. Every person mentioned in her article was investigated thoroughly. Every person she had interviewed was questioned extensively. Every potential enemy she had made during her career was looked at as a possible suspect with motive. Search teams returned to Blue Hole Park repeatedly, using ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and dive teams to search the river systematically. Nothing was found despite exhaustive efforts. Andrew Clark withdrew from his public defender work temporarily, unable to focus on anything except finding Charlotte and getting answers. He hired private investigators with money borrowed from his family. He organized volunteer search parties that combed through Georgetown and surrounding areas on weekends. He appeared on local news programs, pleading for information from the public. Thomas and Patricia Reed drove to Austin and never left, renting an apartment near their daughter's home, waiting for news that did not come. Jessica Williams was devastated by guilt, wondering if she should have asked more questions when Charlotte left that evening, if she should have insisted on going along for safety, if there was anything she could have done differently to prevent this. She provided investigators with every detail she could remember about Charlotte's mood, her words, her demeanor that day. She testified that Charlotte had seemed excited and focused, not frightened or concerned, focused on her work rather than concerned about danger from anyone. As October turned into November and then December, the case began to cool despite continued investigation efforts. Detective Hayes refused to give up, spending his off hours reviewing evidence repeatedly, chasing down leads that other detectives had dismissed as unlikely. He became convinced that the answer lay in identifying who Charlotte had been meeting that night, the mysterious CS referenced in her notes. But without Charlotte's phone, without the voice recorder she had taken, without any witness to her final hours, that identity remained frustratingly out of reach for investigators. As 2019 turned into 2020 and then 2021, Charlotte Reed's disappearance settled into the category of cold cases that haunt everyone involved but yield no new breakthroughs or evidence. Detective Marcus Hayes continued to work the case when time permitted, but with no new leads emerging and intense pressure to focus on cases that were more likely to be solved successfully, Charlotte's file spent more time in storage than on his desk actively. The corruption scandal that Charlotte had exposed continued to unfold in slow motion through the legal system over months. Richard Brennan was indicted on federal corruption charges in March 2020 and eventually pleaded guilty to 2 counts of fraud, receiving a 5-year prison sentence. Marcus Holloway faced a civil lawsuit from the city of Austin seeking to recover misappropriated funds, but criminal charges against him were harder to prove conclusively. His lawyers successfully argued that he had been following legal advice and had not personally authorized the fraudulent activities. By late 2021, most of the legal proceedings had concluded, leaving a trail of damaged reputations and financial penalties, but no definitive answers about whether any of it connected to Charlotte's disappearance. The theory that Charlotte's vanishing was connected to her investigation remained the leading hypothesis among investigators, but investigators had never been able to prove it conclusively. Both Brennan and Holloway had been investigated exhaustively and thoroughly. Their financial records were subpoenaed and analyzed for any payments that might have gone to a hired hand or accomplice. Their phone records were scrutinized for calls to known criminals or fixers. Their associates were questioned repeatedly over time. Nothing concrete emerged that could link either man to Charlotte's disappearance beyond the obvious motive her story had created. Alternative theories emerged and were investigated with varying degrees of seriousness by different investigators. Some suggested Charlotte had stumbled onto something even bigger than the corruption she had been investigating. Perhaps organized crime connections or drug trafficking that used the construction projects as cover for illegal activity. This theory gained some traction when investigators discovered that one of Holloway's subcontractors had previous connections to a criminal organization in Houston, but the link proved too tenuous to pursue effectively with limited resources. Others theorized that Charlotte's disappearance might not be connected to her recent investigation at all, that perhaps someone from an ETOB or earlier story had finally decided to retaliate against her. Charlotte had made enemies throughout her career as an investigative journalist. She had exposed a police officer's misconduct that led to his firing from the force. She had revealed financial improprieties by a school board member. She had written critically about several local business owners. Detective Hayes's team reviewed every story Charlotte had ever published throughout her career, identifying dozens of people who had reason to resent her work, but none who seemed likely to wait years for revenge or who had any obvious connection to the October 6th events. The Internet true crime community adopted Charlotte's case with the same intensity they brought to other high-profile disappearances and mysteries. Forums dissected every detail of the case obsessively. Amateur detectives created elaborate timelines and connection charts. Some claimed to have identified Charlotte's source, CS, through analysis of her article and public records available, though these identifications were always speculative and sometimes bordered on harassment of innocent people. The attention kept Charlotte's name in public consciousness, but rarely produced actionable leads for investigators to follow. For Charlotte's family and friends, the passage of time without answers was torture and agony. Andrew Clark eventually returned to his work as a public defender, but colleagues noticed he was different now, harder and more cynical, carrying a grief that never quite healed properly. He dated occasionally but could not commit to anyone romantically, always comparing them unfavorably to the woman he had lost. On the anniversary of Charlotte's disappearance each October, he would drive to Blue Hole Park and sit in the parking spot where her car had been found, trying to understand what had happened in that place. Thomas and Patricia Reed aged dramatically in the years after their daughter vanished without explanation. Thomas retired early from teaching, unable to maintain the focus required to educate students, while his own child's fate remained unknown and unresolved. Patricia took a leave of absence from the library that turned into permanent retirement from work. They became fixtures at missing persons advocacy events, sharing Charlotte's story and supporting other families going through similar ordeals and trauma. They maintained Charlotte's apartment exactly as she had left it for the first 2 years, paying the rent despite Jessica having long since moved out, unable to bear living in a space haunted by her best friend's absence. Jessica Williams channeled her grief into advocacy work, becoming involved with organizations that supported families of missing persons and that pushed for policy changes to improve how such cases were investigated by authorities. She kept in regular contact with Detective Hayes, calling monthly to check on the case status, to remind him that Charlotte had not been forgotten by those who loved her, to see if any new leads had emerged. Hayes always took her calls personally, always treated her with patience and kindness, but he rarely had anything new to report to her. The case received periodic media attention whenever there was any development, however minor or insignificant. A tip line remained active, and it received occasional calls from the public, most of them from psychics claiming to have visions or from confused individuals reporting sightings that investigation quickly determined were mistaken identity cases. A few tips seemed more credible, but led nowhere when investigated thoroughly. Someone reported seeing a woman matching Charlotte's description in San Antonio in 2020, but security footage from the location proved it was someone else entirely. Another caller claimed to have information about the burner phones used, but when detectives followed up, the caller had no actual knowledge and seemed to be seeking attention. By 2022, Charlotte's case had largely faded from public attention, except among true crime enthusiasts and those personally connected to her life. The Austin Chronicle had published memorial pieces on the anniversaries of her disappearance, celebrating her journalism and lamenting the loss of her voice and perspective. A journalism school at University of Texas, Austin, had established a scholarship in her name for students interested in investigative reporting. These tributes honored Charlotte's legacy, but did nothing to answer the central question: what had happened to her on October 6, 2019? Detective Hayes, now approaching retirement from the force, kept Charlotte's case file in his office rather than in storage. He would review it periodically, looking for connections he might have missed, considering theories he might have dismissed too quickly initially. He had interviewed hundreds of people over the years, reviewed thousands of documents, followed up on countless tips. He had done everything he could think of to find Charlotte or determine her fate. But the case remained stubbornly unsolved, a puzzle missing critical pieces. April 23, 2023, 3 years and 6 months after Charlotte Reed's disappearance, brought the breakthrough that would finally provide some answers, though not the ones anyone wanted to hear or hoped for. A group of college students from Texas State University were Hiking in the remote hill country area near Lake Georgetown, approximately 8 miles from Blue Hole Park, where Charlotte's car had been found. The area was heavily wooded, with steep limestone cliffs and deep ravines that made it challenging terrain for casual hikers without experience. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, one of the students, Emily Rodriguez, ventured off the main trail to photograph wildflowers she had spotted growing near the edge of a ravine for her biology class. As Emily positioned herself for the photograph carefully, she noticed something unusual at the bottom of the ravine, approximately 40 feet below her position. What had initially looked like a pile of old clothes or trash caught her attention because of a specific detail: a brown leather jacket partially visible beneath dead leaves and debris. Emily called to her friends immediately, and one of them, Noah Martinez, used his phone's zoom camera to get a better look at the object. What they saw made them immediately call 911 for emergency services. Georgetown Police and Travis County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the location by 3:15 in the afternoon. Detective Hayes, who had specifically requested to be notified of any potential developments in Charlotte's case, regardless of when they occurred, was contacted immediately and arrived by 4:30 in the afternoon. By 5 in the evening, recovery teams were carefully descending into the ravine to examine what the students had found. The remains were badly decomposed after 3.5 years of exposure to Texas weather, wildlife activity, and natural decay processes. But certain details were immediately identifiable to investigators. The brown leather jacket, though weathered and damaged significantly, was consistent with the one Charlotte had been wearing. Near the remains was a vintage Timex watch, still attached to skeletal wrist bones. Most conclusively, a purse found near the body contained a water-damaged wallet with a driver's license bearing Charlotte's name and photograph. The recovery operation took several hours, with forensic teams carefully documenting the scene and collecting every piece of evidence methodically. The remains were transported to the Travis County Medical Examiner's office, where Dr. Jennifer Walsh conducted a thorough examination over the following 3 days. Dental records confirmed what everyone already suspected. The remains were those of Charlotte Marie Reed, age 31 at the time of death. Dr. Walsh's autopsy report, while hampered by the significant decomposition, provided crucial findings for the investigation. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with a significant fall or blow to the head area. The skull showed a fracture pattern that Dr. Walsh concluded was most likely caused by impact with a hard surface. Given the location of the body at the bottom of a steep ravine with exposed limestone surfaces, the finding was consistent with a fall from height. However, Dr. Walsh noted several details that complicated the picture significantly. First, the position of the body and the pattern of bone breakage suggested Charlotte had tumbled down the ravine rather than falling straight down, implying she had been at the edge rather than simply dropping from the top. Second, there were additional injuries to the skeletal remains, including a fractured rib and damage to the left arm, that were consistent with either a struggle before the fall or with being pushed, rather than accidentally slipping from the edge. Most significantly, Charlotte's skull fracture showed characteristics that Dr. Walsh described as possibly inconsistent with simple fall trauma alone. The fracture had a localized pattern that could suggest impact from a narrower object rather than flat rock surface. While Dr. Walsh could not definitively rule out an accidental fall as the cause, she noted in her official report that the injury pattern could not exclude the possibility of an initial blow to the head followed by the fall down the ravine. The scene investigation provided additional troubling details that raised questions. Charlotte's phone was not found at the scene, nor was the digital voice recorder she had taken with her. The messenger bag containing her laptop and notebook had been in her car, but those items were accounted for from the beginning. The keys to her Honda Civic were never recovered, neither at the ravine site nor in any previous searches conducted. This absence of certain key items suggested someone had been at the scene after Charlotte's death, taking specific objects while leaving others behind deliberately. Detective Hayes worked with forensic analysts to develop a theory of what had happened on October 6, 2019. Based on the location where Charlotte's car was found and where her body was discovered, they constructed this timeline and sequence. Charlotte had driven to Blue Hole Park to meet her source CS as planned. The meeting had taken place somewhere in or near the park area. Something had gone wrong during the meeting. Either Charlotte's source had attacked her, or a third party had been present, or some other confrontation had occurred unexpectedly. Charlotte had either fled or been pursued into the wooded area beyond the park boundaries. 8 miles from where her car was found, at the ravine site, she had died from the head injury, either from a fall or from being struck and then falling down. But this timeline raised as many questions as it answered for investigators. Why would Charlotte and her source meet so far from where her car was parked initially? Had they walked 8 miles through rough terrain in the dark of night? That seemed unlikely given the difficulty of the terrain. Had they driven in a second vehicle belonging to someone? If so, whose vehicle and why had not any witnesses reported seeing 2 cars together? The geography of the area made some details difficult to reconcile with the evidence collected. An alternative theory suggested that Charlotte had been attacked at or near Blue Hole Park, that her assailant had then transported her body to the more remote ravine location to conceal it from discovery, and had staged the scene to look like an accidental fall to mislead investigators. This would explain why her car was at Blue Hole, but her body was 8 miles away in a different location. It would also explain the selective removal of certain items like her phone and keys while leaving others behind. But it required assuming the perpetrator had significant knowledge of the area and had been organized enough to move a body in the dark through challenging terrain without being seen. The identity of CS, Charlotte's source, remained the crucial missing piece of the puzzle. Detective Hayes's team redoubled their efforts to identify this person, reviewing Charlotte's article again with fresh eyes and new perspective, analyzing everyone mentioned in her investigation thoroughly, considering who might have had information that Charlotte needed to confirm before publication. They developed a short list of 5 possibilities, all individuals who worked in or around Holloway Construction or the Austin city government, all with surnames beginning with the letter S. One name in particular drew intense focus from investigators. Craig Sullivan, who had worked as an accountant for Holloway Construction from 2016 to 2018. Sullivan had left the company under unclear circumstances and had reportedly been in financial distress in 2019. He fit the profile of someone who might become a whistleblower against the company. He had access to financial records that would prove the fraud Charlotte was documenting. And his initials matched perfectly the CS notation in Charlotte's notes. When BTO investigators tracked down Craig Sullivan in May 2023 to question him about Charlotte's case, they made a disturbing discovery. Craig Sullivan had died in February 2020, 4 months after Charlotte's disappearance. The death had been ruled a suicide by authorities. Sullivan had been found in his apartment after apparently overdosing on prescription medication combined with alcohol. At the time, his death had been treated as a personal tragedy, a man overwhelmed by debt and depression ending his life. Now, in the context of Charlotte's investigation, the timing seemed far too convenient to be coincidental. Detective Hayes ordered a review of Sullivan's death investigation immediately. The case file revealed troubling details that had not seemed significant at the time, but now appeared potentially sinister in nature. Sullivan's apartment had been found unusually tidy for someone in the throes of suicidal depression, according to experts. His laptop had been wiped clean just days before his death, with all files deleted and the hard drive formatted completely. A neighbor had reported seeing an unfamiliar car parked outside Sullivan's building the night before his body was discovered. But this detail had never been followed up on, since the death appeared to be a clear suicide case. The medical examiner who had performed Sullivan's autopsy was contacted for consultation. She reviewed her findings and confirmed that, while the cause of death was consistent with intentional overdose, there were no suicide note found and no clear indication of suicidal intent beyond the manner of death itself. She acknowledged that the same drug combination could theoretically be administered by another person to an unconscious or restrained victim, though she had had no reason to suspect that at the time of examination. Detective Hayes now faced a chilling possibility and theory. If Craig Sullivan had been Charlotte's source, and if someone had discovered this connection, then both Sullivan and Charlotte might have been murdered to protect the secret they shared. The corruption scandal Charlotte had exposed might have been just the visible surface of something larger and more dangerous, something worth killing to protect from exposure. Further investigation into Sullivan's background revealed that he had made several large cash deposits into his bank account in September 2019, totaling nearly $30,000. The deposits had raised no flags at the time because they were just under the $10,000 threshold that triggers automatic reporting to authorities. Sullivan had told his bank these were proceeds from selling personal property, but there was no documentation to support this claim or prove it. Had someone paid Sullivan for information about the fraud, or paid him to set up Charlotte for an attack? The theory that emerged was dark and complex in nature. Craig Sullivan, desperate for money and facing financial ruin, had agreed to be a source for Charlotte, but had also informed others about her investigation and progress. On October 6th, he had lured Charlotte to Blue Hole Park under the pretense of providing final confirmation for her story. Someone else had been waiting at the location. Charlotte had been attacked, killed, and her body hidden in the remote ravine. Sullivan, now a liability who knew too much about the conspiracy, had been murdered 4 months later, and his death staged as suicide to avoid questions. The corruption story had been published, serving as a limited hangout that satisfied public curiosity while protecting deeper secrets from investigation. But this theory, while plausible and fitting the evidence, remained circumstantial in nature. There was no direct evidence linking Sullivan to Charlotte's death specifically. No proof that his suicide was actually murder. No identification of who the hypothetical third party might have been. Marcus Holloway remained a person of interest, but continued to deny any involvement, and had never been charged with any violent crime. Richard Brennan, serving his prison sentence for fraud, was interviewed again, but maintained he had no knowledge of Charlotte's death, and had never conspired with anyone to harm her. The discovery of Charlotte's remains brought agonizing closure to her family, but few definitive answers about who was responsible for her death. Andrew Clark attended the scene where her body was found, standing at the top of the ravine and trying to imagine Charlotte's final moments on Earth. Thomas and Patricia Reed were finally able to hold a funeral for their daughter, laying her to rest in a cemetery in Houston near where she had grown up as a child. The service was attended by hundreds of people, fellow journalists, sources she had protected, families she had helped through her reporting, and people who had simply been moved by her story and legacy. Jessica Williams delivered a eulogy that celebrated Charlotte's courage and commitment to truth and justice, calling her the best journalist and the best friend anyone could hope to know. She spoke about Charlotte's belief that journalism mattered to society, that exposing wrongdoing and holding power accountable was worth the risks involved, and that the public deserved to know the truth even when powerful people wanted to keep it hidden from view. The words were beautiful and heartbreaking, a tribute to a life cut short, and a legacy that would endure beyond death. The investigation into Charlotte Reed's death remains officially open to this day, classified as a homicide with no suspect in custody. Detective Marcus Hayes retired from the Austin Police Department in December 2023, but continues to work the case as a private consultant, refusing to let it rest until he finds justice for Charlotte. The case file now spans thousands of pages, represents thousands of investigative hours, and includes testimony from hundreds of witnesses interviewed. But the central question, who killed Charlotte Reed, remains frustratingly unanswered. The most plausible theory, supported by the available evidence and the timeline of events, is this. Charlotte's investigation into corruption had uncovered information that was dangerous to people more powerful than she realized or anticipated. Her source, likely Craig Sullivan, had been compromised, either willingly accepting payment to betray her or being coerced into setting her up. On the evening of October 6, 2019, Charlotte drove to Blue Hole Park believing she was meeting Sullivan for a final interview that would complete her story for publication. Instead, she walked into a trap set for her. What happened at that park, and in the hours that followed, can only be partially reconstructed from evidence. Charlotte was attacked, either at the park itself or after being lured further into the surrounding wilderness area. She suffered a catastrophic head injury that caused her death, an injury that forensic analysis suggests may have been inflicted deliberately rather than resulting from a simple fall. Her body was concealed in a remote ravine where it would not be easily discovered by searchers. Her phone and keys were taken to prevent any digital trail from being recovered and analyzed. Her car was left at Blue Hole Park, creating a starting point for the investigation that was miles away from where she actually died. Craig Sullivan, if he was indeed involved in setting up Charlotte, became a liability to whoever had orchestrated the attack on her. 4 months later, he was killed in a manner staged to appear as suicide, eliminating the one person who could directly connect the conspirators to Charlotte's death. With both Charlotte and Sullivan dead, and with the corruption story already published and mostly resolved through legal proceedings, the conspiracy was safe from exposure. The deeper secrets, whatever they were, remained protected from discovery. But this theory, while logical and consistent with the evidence available, cannot be proven beyond reasonable doubt in court. The physical evidence from Charlotte's death scene was compromised by years of weather and decomposition of remains. The digital evidence from her phone was lost permanently when the device disappeared. The witness testimony from Sullivan was impossible to obtain after his death. The financial records that might show payments to conspirators were likely laundered through untraceable channels. Every investigative path eventually hits a wall where proof ends and speculation begins. Certain elements of the case will likely never be fully explained or understood. The exact identity of everyone involved in the conspiracy against Charlotte remains unknown. The specific mechanism by which Sullivan was killed, if his death was indeed murder, cannot be determined with certainty. The question of whether the corruption Charlotte exposed was the full story, or merely covered up something larger, may never be answered definitively. Even the precise location where Charlotte was initially attacked and the exact sequence of events that led to her death at the ravine remain subjects of debate among investigators and analysts. The impact of Charlotte's case extends far beyond the immediate tragedy of her death. Her death sent shockwaves through the journalism community, particularly among investigative reporters who work on sensitive stories involving powerful interests. News organizations have implemented new safety protocols for journalists working on potentially dangerous investigations. Many now require reporters to check in regularly when meeting sources, to share their locations digitally with colleagues in real time, and to never meet potentially hostile sources alone without backup. The corruption story Charlotte died investigating has had lasting effects on Austin politics and governance. The city implemented new oversight procedures for affordable housing contracts, created an independent ethics commission with real enforcement power and authority, and passed stricter conflict of interest rules for elected officials serving. These reforms are referred to informally as Charlotte's Law, a tribute to the journalist whose work exposed the need for them. Marcus Holloway's construction company never recovered from the scandal and was dissolved in 2021. Richard Brennan served 3 years of his 5-year sentence and was released in 2023, returning to private life in disgrace and obscurity. For Charlotte's family and friends, the discovery of her remains provided the closure of knowing her fate, but not the justice of seeing her killer held accountable in court. Andrew Clark has struggled to move forward with his life, carrying the weight of unanswered questions and unfulfilled plans for the future. He keeps a photograph of Charlotte on his desk at work, a reminder of why he chose to become a public defender, to fight for justice in a system that often fails to deliver it fairly. Thomas and Patricia Reed have become advocates for families of murdered journalists, working with international organizations that support press freedom and investigate attacks on reporters worldwide. They speak regularly about Charlotte at events, ensuring her story and her work are not forgotten by the public. Jessica Williams completed a master's degree in journalism and now teaches at the University of Texas, where she regularly shares Charlotte's story with her students enrolled. She uses Charlotte's investigation into the Austin corruption scandal as a case study in ethical journalism, thorough reporting, and the importance of protecting sources. She tells students that journalism can be dangerous, but that the pursuit of truth is worth the risks. That Charlotte believed this deeply and proved it with her life and death. The Austin Chronicle maintains Charlotte's archives and continues to publish investigative journalism in her spirit and memory. The Charlotte Reed Award for Investigative Journalism is now given annually to reporters who demonstrate the same courage and commitment to truth that Charlotte embodied. Past winners have exposed police misconduct, environmental crimes, and financial fraud, continuing the work that Charlotte considered essential to a functioning democracy. But beyond the institutional tributes and the policy changes implemented, Charlotte's case remains what it has always been, a stark reminder of the dangers faced by those who pursue truth in the face of power and corruption. She was a dedicated journalist doing her job professionally, following leads methodically, verifying facts carefully, preparing to publish a story that served the public interest. For this work, she was killed, and nearly 4 years later, her killer has faced no consequences or accountability. The question of who specifically ordered Charlotte's death, who carried it out, and who covered it up may never be definitively answered with certainty. The conspiracy that ended her life was well planned and ruthlessly executed by professionals. The people responsible were smart enough to avoid leaving clear evidence behind, powerful enough to potentially influence the investigation, and cold enough to kill 2 people to protect their secrets from exposure. Detective Hayes continues to review the case file periodically, hoping that new evidence will emerge, or that someone with knowledge will finally come forward with information. He believes that in any conspiracy involving multiple people, someone eventually talks or confesses, that guilt or fear or circumstance leads to confession over time. He is waiting for that moment, for the phone call or the tip or the deathbed admission that will finally break the case open. But with each passing year, the likelihood of that breakthrough diminishes significantly. Charlotte's laptop, recovered from her car, sits in an evidence locker in Austin to this day. The 11-page article she was preparing to submit, the story that may have cost her life, has been printed and saved in multiple locations, a testament to her skill and dedication as a journalist. The corruption she exposed was real and documented. The fraud was proven in court. The criminals were punished, at least partially. Her journalism achieved its goal of exposure. But Charlotte herself never got to see the impact of her work, never got to pursue the next story, never got to live the life she was building with those she loved. If you have any information about Charlotte Reed's death, about Craig Sullivan's death, or about corruption in Austin city government between 2015 and 2019, the Austin Police Department asks that you contact their tip line immediately. Even information that seems minor or that you are unsure about could be the piece that finally brings justice to this case. Charlotte deserves justice. Her family deserves answers. And the people responsible deserve to be held accountable for destroying a life dedicated to truth and public service. The ravine where Charlotte's body was found has become an unofficial memorial site for visitors. People leave flowers there regularly, leave notes, leave small tributes to a journalist they never knew but whose story touched them deeply. Andrew goes there on Charlotte's birthday every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, and sometimes just when he needs to feel close to her memory. He talks to her spirit, tells her about the cases he is working on, about the life he has tried to build without her, about how much he still misses her presence. Charlotte Marie Reed was 31 years old when she died. She was a daughter, a friend, a partner, and above all, a journalist who believed in the power of truth and accountability. She believed that exposing wrongdoing mattered to society, that holding power accountable was essential to democracy, that the public had a right to know what was being done in their name with their money. She lived these beliefs every day of her career, and she died because of them. Her story is a reminder that journalism is not just a profession, but a public service, one that sometimes comes with terrible costs and sacrifices. It is a reminder to protect those who pursue truth, to support investigative journalism financially and morally, and to demand accountability when reporters are threatened or harmed. It is a reminder that in a democracy, the free press is essential to function, and those who attack it are enemies of the people. Rest in peace, Charlotte Marie Reed. January 15, 1988 to October 6, 2019. Your voice was silenced, but your work endures. Your life was taken, but your legacy lives on. You are gone, but you will never, ever be forgotten.